60 minutes. That's all the clock had left before a match that would either turn a name into something permanent or quietly wipe it off the radar for good. And the wild thing is, the young woman at the heart of it didn't look nervous at all. On the other side of the planet, in a country that had never once put a serious name into the global tennis conversation, thousands of people were setting alarms for the middle of the night, refusing to sleep through what was coming. Nobody sitting inside the stands of the All England club had any idea they were minutes away from one of the wildest upsets of the entire season, and the 21-year-old about to deliver it, a young woman we'll simply call Alex, was seconds away from doing something so out of left field that even the seasoned commentators would trip over their words trying to explain it live on air. Buckle in, because this isn't a straight-line story. It bends. It loops back on itself. It yanks the rug out from under you right when you think you've got it figured out, and by the time we reach the finish line, you're going to realize the real twist was never what happened on that court at all. So let's rewind the tape, because none of this makes sense without understanding where the cracks first started to form. Picture a kid, small enough that the racket practically outsized her, smacking balls against a wall somewhere in the Philippines, a nation with absolutely no roadmap for what she was quietly attempting to become. No trail already cut through the jungle. No mentor who'd walked that exact path and left markers behind for her to follow. Just a stubborn, almost reckless certainty that she wasn't destined to be the next promising face in the sport. She wanted to be the first. Sit with that distinction for a second, because next implies somebody already proved the door could be opened. First means you're stepping into a hallway with no idea whether there's even a floor on the other side. Nobody had a camera pointed at that kid. There was no algorithm quietly boosting clips of her early mornings to strangers hyping her up online. There were just years and years of practices that began before sunrise, repeated so relentlessly that the repetition itself became the entire plot, except there was no audience watching any of it unfold. Then something happened that rerouted the whole trajectory of her life without anyone realizing it in the moment. She packed up and left. Not for a short training camp. Not for a few weeks abroad to get a taste of something bigger. She left in the way that actually hurts, relocating to Spain to train inside an academy shaped by Rafael Nadal's own philosophy of the game, a place notorious for stripping a player's confidence down to nothing before rebuilding it from scratch. Now hold that image for a second. A teenager standing shoulder to shoulder with kids from tennis powerhouses, nations with decades of infrastructure, sponsorship money, tradition, history behind every stroke, and she's the wild card nobody's placing bets on. That kind of pressure crushes most young athletes. It genuinely does. But whatever was wired into Alex simply refused to buckle the way it was supposed to. Coaches picked up on it long before results ever showed it on paper, this strange, unsettling calm she carried onto the court, like some part of her already knew how the story ended before the match had even caught up. Here's the first question I want lodged in your brain, because we're circling back to it later and it's going to land differently the second time around. What do you actually do when your own self-belief sprints ahead of any proof to back it up? Because that gap, that uncomfortable, lonely space between conviction and results, is exactly where Alex lived for years. And professional tennis doesn't care one bit about conviction. It's one of the coldest, most unforgiving sports on the planet, and it only rewards what actually shows up on the scoreboard. So the losses came, and they came often. There were stretches where she'd look like a future star for 6 games and then completely unravel over the next 12. There was a season rough enough that people started whispering that cruel little sentence reserved for athletes on the edge. Maybe this is as far as she goes. You've heard that line said about other athletes before, haven't you? It masquerades as an observation, but it's really a verdict, and for a while, that verdict hung over her like a shadow she couldn't shake. But here's where this retelling breaks away from every other version of this story you might have heard. While the public losses kept piling up, something invisible was happening behind closed doors, and almost nobody was paying attention. Her team wasn't fixated on where she sat in the rankings. They were watching her footwork on the second ball of a rally. They were studying whether she'd go for broke on a risky winner instead of playing it safe when a set started slipping through her fingers. They were tracking how fast she could reset mentally after dropping a game she absolutely should have won. None of that trends online. None of that becomes a highlight reel. But it's the exact fine line separating a gifted kid who quietly fades out by 22 from a player who becomes borderline unplayable by 20. Nobody applauded any of it happening. And that's honestly the part that should unsettle you a little, the realization that the most important growth in an entire career can unfold completely out of sight while it's happening. Then came a shift so quiet almost nobody clocked it in real time. Birmingham. A grass court tournament that, to a casual viewer, barely registers as a blip on the calendar. But grass isn't a normal surface to play on. It behaves more like a lie detector. It punishes any hesitation instantly, because the ball refuses to bounce the way your instincts have been trained to expect, and there's no time to overthink anything, only to react. Players who've built entire careers on clay or hard courts often show up on grass and completely fall apart. This was supposed to be her glaring weakness. Instead, she walked away with the whole tournament, her first ever grass court title, and quietly tucked underneath that trophy, every lingering doubt about her ceiling being too low finally got answered without a word needing to be said. She didn't step off that court as a promising kid anymore. She stepped off as a legitimate threat. And threats tend to get remembered right before the one tournament that actually decides everything. Which brings us to Wimbledon, the oldest, most unforgiving stage the sport has ever produced, a place that has swallowed entire careers whole for well over a century and handed back cautionary tales instead of champions far more often than not. Alex walked in seeded 29th, which sounds respectable on paper until you realize what that number is actually telling you. It means there were dozens of players ranked above her who were expected, by every reasonable measure, to go further than she would. Still, she carried something with her that she hadn't fully possessed before. Not hope. Not raw potential. Evidence. Cold, recent, undeniable evidence that she genuinely belonged in this conversation. But evidence still isn't a guarantee, and everybody in that locker room understood the brutal math involved, because every single year dozens of talented young players walk into Wimbledon convinced this is finally their breakout moment, and almost every one of them is gone before the first week even wraps up, forgotten entirely by the following Monday. So when she cruised through her opening match in straight sets, people took notice, but cautiously. Commentators reached for careful, measured language, words like composed and impressive, the kind of restrained praise you give a player you still fully expect to lose eventually. Nobody wanted to overreact. Nobody wanted to be the one who called it too early and looked foolish by the weekend. But underneath all that careful, hedged commentary, something was quietly building momentum. And here's your second question, the one I want sitting uncomfortably in your chest for the rest of this story. What happens when the exact moment everyone is bracing themselves to watch collapse simply refuses to fall apart? Because that's precisely what happened next, and this is where the story stops being gentle. Standing across the net from her in the third round was the reigning Wimbledon champion herself, ranked third in the entire world, a resume so stacked it was supposed to end the conversation before it even had a chance to begin. This wasn't just a rough draw. By every reasonable prediction, it was a formality, the kind of match written into the script where the plucky underdog fights hard, loses with her head held high, gains what commentators love calling valuable experience, and quietly boards a flight home. That's the arc handed to underdogs in this sport almost every single time without exception. Except Alex never bothered reading that script. From the very first exchanges, there wasn't a shred of hesitation in her game, no visible sign that the moment felt too big for her. She played like someone who had already lived through this exact match 1,000 times over inside her own head, on cracked courts back at that unforgiving academy, through every disappointing loss that had quietly been teaching her something nobody else around her could yet see. And slowly, then all at once, the pressure flipped sides entirely. It stopped being a question of whether she could hang with a reigning champion and turned into a question of whether the champion could actually handle her. Center court, one of the loudest, most electric stages on the planet, fell into stretches of eerie silence, that specific kind of hush that only happens when thousands of people simultaneously realize they're watching something they'll be talking about for years to come. Point by point, the impossible stopped feeling impossible, and then, suddenly, it was over. She had actually done it, beating the defending champion, ranked third in the entire world, on the sport's most unforgiving surface, as a 21-year-old representing a country that had never delivered a moment even remotely close to this one. Not once. Not ever. In the entire history of the sport in that nation. Now, most retellings of a story like this one stop right here. Trophy moment, splashy headline, roll credits. But that's genuinely not the most interesting part of any of this, and I already warned you this wasn't going to move in a straight line. The most compelling part of this entire story unfolded somewhere else completely, thousands of miles away, inside living rooms and packed jeepneys and school classrooms and tiny neighborhood sari stores scattered across an entire archipelago, where people had set alarms in the dead of night just to watch a stream buffering on a cracked phone screen, strangers who'd never met huddled around a single device because the signal kept dropping. And nobody wanted to risk missing the exact point that mattered most. This is the part no stat sheet or box score could ever capture, because the moment that match ended, she wasn't simply collecting ranking points on some computer somewhere. She was rewriting, in real time, what an entire generation of kids believed was actually possible for people who looked like them, who came from where she came from, who had been told, quietly but constantly, that this particular sport just wasn't built with their story in mind. That's the part that should genuinely give you chills, far more than any final scoreline ever could. And if you think the emotional weight of this story had already peaked right there, hang on, because it hadn't, not even close. What came next tested her in an entirely different way. Fame doesn't ease anyone in gently anymore. It shows up all at once, an avalanche of interview requests and camera flashes and expectations stacked directly on top of even more expectations, the exact kind of sudden visibility that has quietly unraveled other gifted young athletes long before her. You've watched it happen to other people before. The spotlight flips on, something inside shifts, and the joy that used to fuel them gets buried underneath everyone else's demands for what comes next. This is typically the point where a story like this one takes a darker, sadder turn. She still had to walk back out there 2 days later for the fourth round, facing a former finalist, a 13th seed with far more experience on exactly this kind of stage, and she had to somehow do it all over again with the entire world suddenly locked in and watching. That's an almost impossible ask for anyone alive, let alone someone who had genuinely never been this far before in her career. She battled through 3 full sets. She took the first one. She dropped the second. And in the third, with absolutely everything on the line, in front of a crowd that had specifically shown up because of what she'd pulled off just 2 days earlier, it slipped through her fingers. 6-4, 4-6, 6-3. And here's the moment where most versions of this story would tell you to sit in the disappointment, to dwell on the loss, to treat it as the sad, deflating turn right before the credits roll. But strip away all the emotion clinging to that final scoreline for a second and really look at what's left underneath it. A career-high ranking. Her first ever trip into the second week of a Grand Slam. A run that had already permanently rewritten what an entire country believed was possible, days before that final match had even been played. The loss didn't erase a single ounce of that. It couldn't, because the thing she had already proven, the fact that a young woman from the Philippines could walk onto the biggest stage in tennis and not just survive there, but genuinely threaten the very best player in the entire world, that proof doesn't reset back to zero just because one match happened to go the other way. And once a barrier like that finally cracks open, it doesn't quietly rebuild itself back into place. Every single kid picking up a racket right now in some crowded city street or a tiny province most of the tennis world couldn't even locate on a map is doing it today with a completely different mental ceiling than the one that existed 2 weeks earlier. Because impossible is only a word that holds up until somebody proves it wrong once, publicly, on the single biggest stage that exists in the entire sport. And that's the actual twist buried inside this whole story, the one I promised you back at the very beginning. It was never really about whether she'd walk away with the entire tournament trophy. It was about the exact instant belief and evidence finally lined up in front of an entire nation at the very same time, and neither one of them needed the other's permission to exist anymore. So here's the question I want to leave sitting with you as we wrap this up, the one this whole story has quietly been circling back to since the very first line. We opened by asking who she was and how absolutely nobody saw this coming. But maybe that was always the wrong question to be asking in the first place. Maybe the real question worth sitting with is this: how many more of her are out there right now, grinding away on cracked, sun-baked courts, in places this sport has never once taken seriously, waking up hours before sunrise, quietly absorbing disappointments nobody is filming, building something completely invisible that the rest of the world won't understand until one single afternoon forces everybody to pay attention all at once. Because if this entire run proved anything at all, it's that breakthroughs never actually happen as suddenly as they appear to from the outside looking in. They get constructed slowly year after year, in total silence, and then they get revealed all at once in a handful of unforgettable matches that the rest of us only ever see once the real work has already been finished behind the scenes. She didn't just win one match on a patch of grass in London. She proved, in the most public way imaginable, that where you happen to start doesn't have to determine where you eventually finish. And for a country that had waited its entire modern tennis history for a moment exactly like this one, that proof is going to matter a whole lot longer than any single scoreline ever will. And this definitely isn't the end of her story either. If anything, everything leading up to this point was simply the setup. Whatever comes next, none of us have actually seen it yet. And if these last few years have taught us anything at all about her, it's this. Betting against Alex has never once been a smart idea, and it probably isn't about to start being one now.